this paper that you picked up, it's a two-sided one where you have a rubric on one side, and then when you get to the other, it talks about Keystone free response, constructive response question. I want to kind of start off with the rubric a little bit. Today is a little bit more of an explanatory day, where we're just kind of going over to make sure you understand what's happening. So, Gavin, we still want your head up. This wonderful information is going to start to seep in there. And we'll probably kind of start taking a look at how a response is going to be set up. We've talked a little bit about Keystone exams and all that kind of stuff, and how excited you folks are to be taking them and whatnot. When you do your Keystone, you're taking a look at, it's considered to have 52 questions to it, or 52 points. Of your Keystone, 34 out of the 52 points are multiple choice. 52 minus 38 leaves you with, 52 minus 34 leaves you with
17.
18. There we go. So you have, slide down. So Keystone's made up out of 52 points. 34 of those points are going to be multiple choice questions. You haven't taken any exact Keystone multiple choice questions yet. I've given you ones that are similar to them so far as like with Oedipus Rex and some of those kinds of questions. Well, I'm going to show you some real past Keystone multiple choice questions. I think compared to the stuff that we did for Oedipus, you're going to find them to be much easier. The 18 points, and then Nate, I'll get to you here in a second. The 18 points that are left, that comes from the constructed response questions, which the synonym that you're going to use for a constructed response, you folks are going to think of them as being essay questions. They're not quite essay questions because you're not doing multiple paragraphs, intro, three-body paragraphs, conclusion. You're really just writing one paragraph at a time for each constructed response. Constructed response question is out of 3 points total. So you have 18 constructed response points, 3 points for each question. That means you're going to have a constructed response happening 6 times. There's 6 passages that you're going to be reading. Each reading that you do, 3 are fiction, 3 are nonfiction, is going to have a constructed response question that goes along with it. So it's not a 100-point essay assignment. You're not doing one big long essay for all these different texts. You're doing one kind of short response question for each passage.
How many points do you need to pass?
I was waiting for that question to come up. It varies a little bit from year to year. Generally speaking, if you are getting about 2/3 of the points, you pass. So, like for example, say you have 34 points, you get this would be more than 2/3, but you get 24 points. 2/3 from here, you get, let's say you go 13 points, that gives you a grand total of a 37, you're going to be passing. Okay? It's not an impossible task whatsoever to pass. Some passages you'll probably find easier or harder than others, but it's certainly not impossible. Keystone is not timed. So they'll give you, like say in your schedule, they'll block off like periods 1 to 3. So Nate, you're going to take it periods 1 to 3. Dylan's going to be taking it periods 6 through 8. Kind of thing. If you're not done at the end of that time, you can still keep going. Now, if you're at the very end of the day, at like 9th period or whatever, they'll let you pick up with it tomorrow. But it's not that you have to be done within half an hour or 40 minutes an hour. Probably have plenty of time. It pretty much breaks down to you would be reading a passage, answering multiple choice questions, doing a constructive response. If you can do that within 40 minutes for each one, you'll be fine. You'll be okay. But if you need more time, you take more time. The worst thing that a person could do would be like, yeah, I don't feel like doing a constructive response. I'm done. Because now you're pretty much giving up those points. Folks who, looking at last year's scores, you'll see folks who did really well in the multiple choice, and then they tapped out when the free response question was coming around because they didn't feel like doing it. And for some, that's what kept them from passing. Not good for
So
you.
like, even if you attempt it.
So, take a look. Yeah, I mean, if you there is, as far as, I don't mean this to sound like, that everyone here should be smart enough to at least be able to do this, but if you put forth effort, I don't see why you should not be able to get at least a 2 out of a 3. What they're asking you for for a 3 is by no means impossible. So it is certainly very doable. I would argue it is expected. From ability standpoint, there's no one sitting in this room that can't get 24 out of 34 that wouldn't be able to get a 12 or a 13 out of 18 on 3 response questions. Because you're not writing a full essay. You're not coming up with something original. You're not doing a research paper. You're basing it from a text, from a story, like what you would have with Lambda and Slide. So take a look here at this sheet here. At the top, you have the question where it says prompt. This one is made specifically to kind of go with, Lambda the Slaughter, since that would be story that we have just read. Explain how Dahl's use of both situational and dramatic irony contribute to the tone of the Lambda the Slaughter. Key words, therefore, that we would want to be looking for to make sure we understand what we have here is going to be situational, it's going to be dramatic irony, and then we were talking a little bit yesterday about what kind of tone. So essentially what you would have to be explaining is how do those examples of irony that are in the story contribute to the tone of the Lambda the Slaughter. Anytime you're doing a constructive response, whether it be on a Keystone exam or it's one that we're doing in here, you have the book, you have the story, you have the text in front of you. So you wouldn't be doing this from memory, because if you're doing multiple choice questions, you're going to have the story that you're going to be able to pull from, the passage that you're going to pull from, all those things. So what did we have to do with your Oedipus Rex story or essay, with your Metamorphosis story? You made an argument, and then you cited examples from the text to support what your argument was. You're doing the exact same thing that would be happening with a constructive response. Do we know what situational irony is?
Yes.
Yeah. Josh, what is it?
It's like when something happens and you don't expect it.
Okay, so what would be an example of situational irony from the Lambda Slaughter?
She kills her husband.
Okay. Do we know what dramatic irony is?
Yes.
What's an example of dramatic irony? Okay, so what would be something from the story that we know that the character doesn't? And who doesn't? Okay, so we know what those things are. We know what tone is, the overall mood, the attitude. The tricky part is going to be explaining how those things kind of go together. So there are some elements that do make it a little bit, trickier maybe than others. Take a look at what a description is of a 3. So here of the boxes that you have, a response is a clear and thoughtful analysis of how Dahl's use of both situational and dramatic irony contribute to the tone of the story. The response accurately identifies at least 3 separate examples. Josh, how many examples did you give me? Jack, how many examples did you give me? So we have 2 at this point. We would need to come up with a 3rd. But you have at least 3 separate examples of irony, at least one being situational, one being dramatic. That 3rd one would be an option for us to come up with from the passage that contributes toward the tone. The writer fully explains the desired tone of the story and how the irony helps to shape it. The response includes relevant and specific information from the text. What is not a part of that rubric, or not a part of that score? What does not factor into why you get a 3, a 2, or a 1? That on essays, I would take into consideration that most writing assignments you would kind of think about that your English teacher is going to be taking into consideration. But what aspect of writing is not mentioned anywhere in that description?
How long grammar?
Doesn't say anything about how long it is. Doesn't say anything about grammar. So it's not testing you on do you know when to use a semicolon, do you know when to use a period. Now, it does have to be legible, it does have to be readable. If you can't spell, any of the words and we're trying to rotate the page to figure out what it is that you're writing, that could be problematic. But there is not a sentence requirement to it, a paragraph requirement. You're not getting assessed on grammar. You're getting assessed, can you tell what irony is for this specific question and how it contributes to what the tone of the story is. Now, Nate, it doesn't say how long it has to be. You're probably going to have to write more than 2 or 3 sentences, but it's not, well, this was a really nice response, great job, but you should have at least 15 sentences. That's not part of what it's looking for. If, for a 2, I said I would expect that everyone should be able to get a 2 at the very least. Response is limited or incomplete analysis of how Dahl uses both situational and dramatic irony to contribute to the tone. Response accurately identifies maybe 2 or 3 examples, so maybe it doesn't have the full 3 that would be there that contributes toward the tone. The writer touches on the desired tone, but may struggle to fully explain how the irony helps to shape this tone. So they're identifying all the parts that they need, but maybe it's just not quite a full analysis that's taking place at this point. But for a score of a 2, you can see the effort is there, the evidence is there, they understand what the question's asking them to do, might not just be able to fully kind of explain what was going on. So if for the metamorphosis essay, the idea of you knew what a symbol was, but you had a hard time explaining how does the window correlate to his alienation, maybe that would kind of fall it into the 2 range a little bit, but there's certainly no reason why we would be falling into 1 or a 0. Response for a 1 would be something like, we have lamb for Thanksgiving instead of turkey. That's ironic. Don't write that. All right, flip the paper over. Nate, they don't tell you how long they want the response to be, but I tell you how long I want the response to be. 10?
He said that.
10?
He said that.
Oh my goodness, 10? The acronym that we pretty much go for when it comes to a constructed response is we want you to do what's considered a race. Want you to restate, answer, cite, explain. So the idea would be in your first sentence, basically within this thesis sentence or within your topic sentence, you're going to restate what the question is asking and make sure you are answering it. So you could restate it in the sense that Dahl uses both situational and dramatic irony to contribute toward his tone. What you would have to answer would be the type of tone that is getting utilized. But you're taking what the prompt is asking you to do, and you're basically using that for your topic sentence. So Jack, what do we do with the first sentence? Stay with me. And answer. So in that first sentence, you are restating and answering. Tell me, how many sentences do I need?
10.
So I have taken care of restate and answer with one of those, which is going to leave me with 9. How many examples of irony do I need from the story? 3. I need 3. So the easy math lets you know that then the rest of my 9 sentences, I have 3 going towards one example, 3 going towards the second example, 3 going towards my third example. So 1 thesis statement and then 3 examples coming in. So for this part, I'm going to do a cite and explain 3 times. In a way, the citing and explaining is kind of like what you were doing in body paragraphs, but not as detailed. You don't need a topic sentence for the body paragraph. You don't need a concluding sentence. You're just making sure that you are citing an example from the text that's going to prove that your thesis is correct. So you're going to be citing an example of irony, and then you're going to be explaining how does that irony lead to whatever the desired tone was that you were selecting where you have your explanation. Down below, and you kind of had to know this was coming based on essay examples that we've been doing and what I had with your active reading assignment from yesterday. No, they're not going to test you for this on the Keystone where you have to have this rotation of simple, compound, complex sentences. But if you get in the habit of doing it, you will answer the question fully, explain the relationship where you wouldn't have any left out parts where you're tying everything in together. So your first part, when you do that restate and answer, you're just going to do that in a simple sentence. Then you cite your example from the text, and we're going to kind of do this as an example in a complex, and then just explain it in those 2 sentences, a simple and a compound, and then you just keep doing over and over and over again with it. But you're not writing multiple paragraphs, you're not writing a full working essay, you're doing 10 sentences. Your intro, when you did your metamorphosis essay, how many sentences did you have for an attention grabber? Yeah, 2 sentences. followed your attention grabber with a transition, which was a third sentence. You had background. For your background, you wrote 2 sentences, so now you're up to 5. You did a thesis and a focus. So your intro paragraphs are already 7 sentences. You're writing 3 sentences more. You did a topic sentence for your body paragraph. Usually then you did 1 to 2 sentences explaining what was going to be your example. You quoted your example, then you had 3 sentences of explanation coming after that, so you're up to 7. Some of you had 2 or 3 sentences falling under. So it's pretty much what equivalent would be of 1 body paragraph. It's not that difficult. What it does require you to do is maintain your focus. I don't think people have a tough time with the first constructive response question that they have to do. I think where people struggle is going to be the third one that you have to do after Connor already did one and already did the second. Then it's making sure he's maintaining focus and being able to do that third. But the format, the setup for all of them is going to be exactly the same. Where do you see there being issues, problems? Do you see there being any issues or problems?
Too many.
Well, that makes my life easy. What?
Too many
Too many what?
responses. There should be like 1.
You're writing 3 paragraphs in one day. You can handle. You can handle.
I can handle
I think we should write
just one big sentence.
Yeah, we should just have 6 days.
No.
I agree with Nate.
I think we should have 1 big.
You're not. You're not fighting what you can't change. You can't change.
Well, you said it. Is there anything that we have a problem with?
Well, is there anything that is prohibiting you from having the capability of completing it?
Yes.
Not enough time.
Yes.
You got unlimited
No
time.
time.
Not this time is.
All right. So.
Can't spend doing
Come on.
What?
Oh, yeah.
All right, Josh. Refresh our memories. What was your example of irony? Refresh yourself.
Oh, she killed her husband with the lamb.
Josh, dramatic or situational? Okay, so Mary killing her husband, and I'd get scrap piece of paper out where we're just going to make a list of stuff. Mary kills her husband, she uses the like lamb. This would be an example of situational irony. Jack, you gave us an example of... Okay. All right, so we said we know that she's the killer. The characters who did not were the police. What would be other examples, situational or dramatic? Anywhere within the story.
When they're eating the food and they don't know that it's
Situational, dramatic. Okay, so police eat the weapon, and they even have the line, what does the one sergeant say? What does Noonan say about it?
the murder weapon is right under our nose.
And literally they're taking a bite from the leg of lamb that would be under their nose at the time. So police are eating the weapon, it's right under their noses, be an example of dramatic irony. What else? Situational or dramatic? And Sam is the? Okay. So Mary, I'm going to say quote unquote, preparing dinner for Patrick while speaking with Sam. This would be dramatic irony. Anything else?
Like when she's telling the cops the story,
Okay. Like,
like that he was home, like she left him there to go get the food.
okay, so when she's kind of like,
She came
and,
back and it was just on the floor.
okay, so her story of not necessarily her creating the alibi the way that she was with Sam, but not only is it the police don't know that she is the killer, but we know that the story that she's giving them obviously is false, that she left. So Mary's, I'll say, the false account of what happened. Again, dramatic.
Bless you.
You're supposed to guess.
You'll have to figure it out.
Why can't you? I can't see it.
You have to come up and do a closer study.
So Mary's.
What else?
Definitely.
I'm thinking of something also like when talking to the police, I'd say it'd be a little bit different than us knowing that she is the murderer or the fact that, you know, how the murder actually took place with leaving Sam. What is the primary thing that the police are looking for? The main thing they're looking for is the weapon. They can't find the weapon. What does Mary say indirectly about the weapon? Because we know the weapon is like a lamb. But does she mention anything? Because when she's talking about her story, you know, I left, Patrick was here, I went to the grocer, I bought some things, I got some peas, carrots, potatoes, all that kind of stuff, you know, cheesecake, came back. What does she do with the lamb? Puts it in the oven. It's right there in the oven now. What does she literally tell the police? She tells them where the murder weapon is. So, you know, not only is it that we know that she's the killer and things like that, but the police are trying to find the weapon. Mary tells them where the weapon is. I'd say one other maybe piece of situational irony that we wouldn't be expecting at the beginning of the story, before she kills her husband. I mean, why does she have to, or not have to, but what's her reasoning for killing her husband? He's going to leave her based on the way that she seems to love her husband, is excited that he's going to be coming home from work. She's 6 months pregnant at this point, you know, going to have a child in 3 months. Probably would not be expecting that Patrick would leave. So that could be certainly an example of situational irony. Mark, I don't know if you remember this, but you mentioned a thing about piece of irony with Mary's name when we were making predictions about the story.
Oh, yeah, Mary had a little lamb.
We know, you know, a little rhyme, Mary had a little lamb. You could argue, is there a little, and is this something that we'd write about? I don't necessarily know, but Mary had a little lamb. You could argue that this is a little bit of like situational irony in that why is her name significant, important? Is that why he chose the name Mary? I'm not 100% sure, but I think so. What element does that kind of add when you think of, oh, Mary had a little lamb to the slaughter. Mary kills her husband with a piece of lamb. That's kind of,
Lots of lamb.
you know, there's a little bit of humor that could be going on with that that you might incorporate into the story. Yeah, it could be part of that dark humor. So once you come up with a list, and keep in mind, you're not going to be writing about all of these. We have 3 examples of situational irony. We have, I think, 4 examples of dramatic irony here. You're going to decide which ones are going to work best for you, which 3 you ultimately would use. Before you decide which 3 you would select, you do have to make one more decision. What is the story's overall tone? If you don't know what the tone is, or if you don't make a decision as to what the tone is, then you're just randomly picking examples of irony for this one. But if you decide what the tone is, and you could go with one or two, you wouldn't have to have necessarily it just being one answer. You could have two types of tone. But if you know what your types of tone would be, then it becomes easier to select which examples you would go with. And again, that thesis statement, Jack, what are the two things we're doing in the thesis statement? Restating and
Answer.
thank you, Jack. And by answering, we would be identifying what that type of tone is. So when it comes to our tone, what would be tone words that we would want to use?
Evil. Terrible.
I think if you're thinking evil, I think sinister would be more of the tone word that would go along with it.
That's what I said.
Julia, you were just saying when we said like Mary had a little lamb that adds to the dark humor or a little bit of a comedic tone. I don't know if it's going to show up with me writing. There we go. So dark humor, comedic. Any other tones? Is it scary? Is it frightful?
No.
Is it, it's slowly going to say comedic. C-O-M-E-D-I-C. There we go. Is it persuasive? Is it inspiring? No. So it's more probably of that little bit of twisted humor, a dark humor. You could argue that there's a little bit of sinister. Some folks might go that there is a sympathetic tone, depending on your feeling with Mary. That could be an option. We don't have to decide as a whole class, as a whole group, what that one tone would be or what the two tones would be, but you would want to figure out which ones would I feel most comfortable writing about. If you feel that, hey, there's some sympathetic tone that would be going on, what would be a primary example that you would certainly want to use? If you're going sympathetic,
Patrick Leader.
I would want to mention the Patrick Leacher, because that's going to help kind of create that sympathetic tone. If you're going with something that is sinister, which I would say it kind of is, but probably the primary sinister example I would want to use. She kills her husband with a frozen club, essentially. Comedic tone?
Mary.
Oh, she was laughing.
Could mention Mary had a little lamb.
How she dabs.
When you have the police are eating it right underneath their noses, her kind of giggling at the end. You could argue that her giggling would add to both the humor as well as the sinister because there's not a whole lot of remorse that would be taking place at that point. Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah.
And your teacher just stole the words right from your mouth. Your shining moment of glory just vanished.
Why did she
Yeah.
default?
Like your football career.
Oh.
Is this our work this weekend? That was too far.
Sorry. Not really.
Just get the score ball.
Nate, I shot like 3 for 20 from the field today, so my basketball career vanished.
Yeah, I see you can
Nate, since I stole your glory, what tones do you feel like you'd be using?
Evil.
Okay. You going to go strictly evil?
Probably.
Okay, I'm not trying to change your answer and take multiple ones. Which examples then do you feel that you'd be using?
She killed her husband, that they ate the weapon, and that they don't know she killed Pat. No, there's a kid in my gym class named Pat, so I just said Pat. I'm used to that.
So you're going the first three.
Yep.
Okay. Anyone see themselves using a different tone?
Yes.
I'm not there yet. Okay. So if we go comedic and dark humor, Julia, which examples do you see yourself using?
Oh my god.
Shh, folks, listen up still. Okay. So eating murder weapon right underneath the noses. Right, so. Okay. And I would say no matter which tone you end up going with, you're probably going to want somehow, some way include this one here with Mary killing her husband. I'd say for 2 reasons. You want to guess one? It's the main part of the story. It's the main element. Yes, listen up. It's the main element. It's the big time event. Plus, most of, and I wouldn't say most of, because it is a pretty even break, but the types of examples of irony that we were coming up with very quickly were primarily which type? Situational or dramatic? We were coming up with mostly dramatic. You have to have an example of situational. That's the primary one. That's probably the most obvious one. So that's the one that we would want to start off with. Yes. So you could go that there is a sinister yet like dark humor. If we were to combine those, tone that happens, that would be fine. All right, pay attention here real quick, because Gavin was asking the $1 million question. What does this do? Monday, we are going to begin writing this. We are going to work on it as like a class example. So next week, Monday and Tuesday, we're putting together a constructive response. This one is not going to be graded for you, but this one in some ways will be your most important one because it's going to be your template. So as we do other ones, you'll end up using this as like your model to kind of follow through with a proper structure when we move on to some other ones. So keep this sheet handy. Monday, we'll start writing it.
All I heard is that you add to the variable so that you can.
No, did not say that. If you didn't list any kind of examples, like say you just did some kind of story, 1 or a 0. Like you prove that you've read it, but you're not forgiven. Well, and it's not that you're saying that to take this with you. But the idea is that enough of these that you start to get into the routine. But it's no different than
It's like embarrassing to get him with the same.
really, when it's just a condensed version of the essay. So you've proven you can do the essay part, now it's just breaking it down into even really smaller one. But I'd rather start with the difficult one and then move to the easier than vice versa.